Welcome everyone to the 2023 annual public meeting for C-10 Research and Education Foundation. I'm Sarah Abramson, I'm the Executive Director. It has been just over one full year since I've had this position with C-10, and it has been a very exciting year. Thank you. You'll hear about a lot of the exciting things that happened. Some were planned projects that we were really excited to execute, and some were total surprises that some of you might remember from last July. So we'll go over those and what's in our future for the next year, and we'll also hear from some great speakers today. For those of you who aren't familiar with C-10, the C stands for citizens and the 10 is 10-mile radius. That's the federally designated emergency planning zone around the Seabrook nuclear power plant. So that's where our name comes from. We serve the communities that lie within that 10-mile radius, and that includes 6 communities in Massachusetts and 11 in New Hampshire. So the foundation of our organization is these 3 pillars. These are the 3 programs that we provide services to these communities. That's radiation monitoring, public outreach and education, and also advocacy with decision makers that impact our lives. I want to just recognize the folks that make all of the magic happen. We are a very small organization. We are small but mighty, we like to say, and we run on a very lean budget. It is 2 staff members, just myself and Mike Manser in the back there. His official title is network administrator, but really a wizard is the term that I've started to use because if there's anything that needs to be done, he can conjure the skill to do it. We also have an incredible board. They volunteer their time. They are generous financially. They bring to us a variety of skill sets. You'll see from this list, we are so grateful and blessed to have so many talents that contribute to C-10's work. The Board of Advisors is also a wonderful resource to us. We find ourselves in very technically challenging places, things that require a lot of scientific expertise or legal expertise or accounting expertise. And we are always so grateful for the work of these folks who also donate their time and their services to us. We also have funders. We are funded mostly through a contract with the Department of Health, and they fund that radiation monitoring program that I'd mentioned. But we are also funded by private foundations. We do a lot of grant seeking to fund our other programs. And some of those are listed here in addition to business owners in the area who also see the value in our work and support us that way. Not least of all, our membership. Individual donors make up a sizable portion of our budget, and so it is with the support of the people that we serve that we're able to do what we do. So tonight's agenda, I'm your host, MC. We'll start with this welcome that I'm already mostly through, and then we'll do sort of the boring functional part of this meeting, which is to nominate and elect our officers for our board of directors. And then we'll go over a review of the last year. We'll have some guest speakers, and you'll hear also again about what we're planning to do in the next year ahead. If you didn't grab a program, there is a program available if you're in person on this table that has this agenda, so you can follow along as well. And at the end, we will have a question and answer period. I'm going to invite the folks attending via Zoom to please type out your questions as you come up with them or at the end. And we'll actually start with some questions from our virtual folks first to make sure that they get some participation before we open it up to the folks that are here in person. So let's start with the election of the Board of Director officers. So I have received nominations for each of these Board of Director members for these offices. So I'd like to ask them to please stand if they are present. So Patricia Skibby for President. She's our incumbent President. Carrie Stratton Boyd for Vice President. Again, she's incumbent. This is a role she holds now. Marielle Gomez-Kafer, she is attending virtually, so she might be raising her hand in the chat right now. And Karen Claggett, our incumbent clerk. Is there a motion? All in favor to elect these officers as nominated, please say aye. Aye. All opposed? Okay, it's passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone. As the perfunctory portion of this meeting, the rest will be much more dazzling and informational, I promise. So I'll start with a year in a review of what C-10 has been up to. And if you follow along on our newsletter, you might be somewhat aware. And if you don't follow along on our newsletter, please sign up. We would love to keep you up to date on what we do. So I did some foreshadowing earlier about some unexpected things that came our way in the last 12 months. And one was a false evacuation alarm that happened in July. So you may remember when a technician at the plant was doing some testing of the siren system, they inadvertently activated the real alarm system for the Seacoast, New Hampshire sirens only. So there was a siren that sounded instructing beachgoers to evacuate and that there was an issue at the plant. And it went on for over 20 minutes. The timeline of those issues were pretty severe in terms of communication gaps. So there were huge failures by the part of the plant in communicating with not just the public, but also the state officials. And then in turn, the state officials couldn't make good communication to their residents on what was happening and whether or not they needed to evacuate. So C-10 was involved in this, whether we liked it or not, because our phone was ringing off the hook. People were doing a lot of Googling Seabrook Station evacuation. And as you might know, our website is chock full of information on how you can prepare for a radiological emergency, where are the brochures, where is the potassium iodide tablets for your family. So we were getting phone calls, emails, social media inquiries, the media was reaching out to us, and some local and state legislators and elected officials also reaching out to us. Lucky for us, we have the cell phone number of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission resident inspector. So that is the federal regulator that works in the plant every day. He lives in Exeter, New Hampshire with his family, with his children. He is very invested in the safety of the plant, and we're lucky to have his cell phone number. So he was the first person I called. So once I confirmed that it really was an inadvertent evacuation, I could also advise the public that C-10's radiation monitoring network was not reading any abnormalities. Some people, when they heard the message, no, it's not an emergency, nothing to see here, they didn't trust that message coming from a state agency or coming from the plant. As we know in general, in our current society, there is a lack of trust against the media, against elected officials, against corporations. And so C-10 is proud to serve as that trusted resource of unbiased information. And we will always be data focused and deliver the truth. And I think that this was a great example of how people trusted us and to deliver that information. So both the state of New Hampshire and the federal regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, completed investigations and did publish reports that cited failures and violations of the plant in this situation. Some were technical, so the siren system is extremely outdated, and this should have never been possible. They actually aren't allowed to be hardwired into the siren system the way that they were to accidentally activate it. So that was one problem, a technical issue. And then also the communication problems were pretty obvious and pretty glaring. There's actually a red phone inside the plant, kind of like the red phone in the Oval Office, that the emergency management agencies of the state are supposed to be able to call and get an immediate answer. And it sounds like from these reports that that also wasn't being utilized properly in this scenario, and it should have been. So there are a lot of lessons learned. All we can hope for is that moving forward, they're going to do better. But the only way to make sure that that happens is accountability. And C-10 is really good at holding people accountable for their promises. You say you're going to fix a problem. Okay, lip service isn't something that we necessarily accept. We will follow up with you, and we will ask you to provide receipts on the work that you said that you were going to do. So on the community outreach and education aspect, so this year we've had a lot of in-person events in the communities that we serve, and it has been really fulfilling to meet the people, especially the kids and the faces of the folks that you're doing this work for. In particular, we really want to reach families with young children because children and women of childbearing age are the most vulnerable to the side effects of radiation exposure. And that's because of the rate at which their cells are duplicating. So we in particular want to make sure that those residents have potassium iodide tablets in their emergency planning kit. That is something that is legally supposed to be provided for free to all residents inside the 10-mile emergency planning zone. It operates differently in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, how you can obtain that. Sometimes you have to do a Google search and click maybe a dozen times before you get to the page to figure that out. So C-10, knowing that that's too high a burden to place on the resident or the individual, created a single website a single page on our website where you can access all of this information. We created these beautiful bookmarks that have a QR code and a URL that will bring you directly to that page. And we're trying to hand these out and disperse them en masse. And then on the other side of it, we're trying to help and coordinate with the people who are in the municipal offices that are tasked with doing this. What are you experiencing as barriers? Why aren't more people getting these pills from you? How can we help you with advertising this program? So it's a twofold approach, and we've already seen some pretty great gains. And it's a research project that we're going to carry through the rest of the year. We had an Earth Day event in April in front of Newburyport City Hall, and we asked the health agent for Newburyport to join us there and to distribute these potassium iodide pills on site. In that 1 hour, she handed out as many pills as she usually does in a year. So that kind of shows you that there isn't an intentionality between the barriers that exist, but there are barriers that are preventing people from obtaining these services, and we are really passionate about breaking those down. So advocacy work, one of our pillars, our third one. Seabrook's degrading concrete might be something that all of you are familiar with, and if you're not, this is a really high-level beginner introduction to what the problem is. Seabrook was the first nuclear power plant in the United States where alkali silica reaction, but we're going to call it ASR for the rest of this presentation to save me time, was detected in concrete. This is also called concrete cancer, and it is incurable. It happens when water reacts with alkali in the cement. So not all cement has the right aggregates for this reaction to occur. It just so happens that Seabrook's concrete contains these aggregates. When this reaction happens, a gel forms and microcracking happens, and it won't stop. Only more microcracks will appear over time, and that weakens the concrete. And as I said, there's no cure, and there was no regulation. There's no written rules about it because this is the first of its kind. So there's a real opportunity here for us to either get it right or get it wrong. And C-10 is spending a lot of time and effort to try to make sure that we get it right. So Seabrook Station's original license was set to expire in 2030. And shortly after this concrete problem was discovered, they applied for a license renewal so that they could operate until 2050. And those original license terms did not contain robust measures related to this ASR problem. For example, they wanted to check on this ASR problem every 10 years, which is pretty unacceptable. So C-10 launched a legal challenge and was awarded status to intervene in that license renewal. And we were so lucky again to have expertise from world-renowned expert Dr. Victor Salma, who knows ASR and knows concrete degradation more than most people on the planet. He's worked with the government on dams, on other structures where this has happened. And his testimony to the NRC compelled them to award C-10 some of the things we were asking for. So instead of every 10 years, the plant is checking on this concrete problem every 6 months, which is a pretty big difference. So a regulation in writing is one thing. Compliance with those rules is another. So when I talked earlier about collecting receipts, are you doing the work that you are supposed to be doing? Well, C-10's team reads the inspection reports that are published by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We read every single one. And in those reports, you'll see that the plant is in violation of those same hard-won rules that were put in place to track this concrete problem. In addition to failing on the concrete, they're also failing in fire safety, repeat violations of the same types of problems, leaving out flammable materials, not having the right types of fire patrols walking around. Other violations included radiation exposure to a contractor that was on site, and also the handling of radioactive nuclear waste as it was loaded into the ground in a cask. So C-10 is taking these things very seriously because they are serious. And so what do we do with this information? Well, we communicate with the resident inspectors that I talked about. You know, they do allow us to have meetings with them, and they'll explain to us, you know, things that we might ask for clarification on. But where the rubber meets the road is that we need to escalate when there is too much inaction. Repeat violations call for more measures from the NRC than just a slap on the wrist. So we've contacted legislators and federal regulators, and we've used the legal channels that are available to us. And that included submitting a formal petition to the NRC to ask for them to do some extraordinary enforcement. That petition was ultimately denied, but not before we made it through every hurdle that not many petitions make it through, because our petition had merit, our petition was scientifically based, and we were awarded a full hearing before the board. That was a great opportunity to get these issues brought to light. We, of course, would have liked to see the petition accepted, but every report that comes out, inspection report, there's more information that gives us the grounds to submit another petition or take another road to action. So it won't be the last that the NRC hears from us in terms of these compliance issues. So the last pillar is our radiation monitoring network, which is really the cornerstone of C-10. And I mentioned the Massachusetts Department of Health and the Emergency Management Agency fund us to do this. So states who have a nuclear plant near them have to do radiation monitoring of the air, of the water, of the soil, of the shellfish, of the dairy that comes out of the cows. So C-10 is a really powerful tool in the state's toolbox to do that air radiation monitoring. And so some of the cool things that we've been doing is digitizing our data. You know, it's 2023 and technology has advanced and is advancing at an incredible pace. And data analytics is a very powerful way to use the information you have to do new things and make really compelling arguments potentially to decision makers. So when I talked about Mike, our wizard, he worked with a couple folks pro bono. Again, we found some wonderful experts that connected us through the Informs program, which is a Massachusetts state program. And they turned, I'm talking hundreds of millions of data points into a database where we can put in a date, put in a town, and produce these wonderfully helpful graphs that illustrate what we were seeing in the radiation that day. This is really important because the plant does publish its own effluent reports. So that tells the regulators how much they're emitting. This is a way to, again, provide accountability that those are accurate and that allowed levels aren't being exceeded. This is also a way for perhaps human health impact studies can leverage this information. So we really want to thank Alva Dillon and Philip Fry, who were the two that volunteered their time to do this, and Mike, of course. I'm actually going to invite Mike up to do a little Between the Ferns interview here, and we're going to talk about a really cool project that we executed, upgrading our monitoring network. So Mike, will you join me up here? Making sure it's viewable for our at-home folks. All right, well, thank you, Mike.
My pleasure, Sarah.
Now, I brought you up here just to talk about this one project, because if you talked about everything that you did, we would never leave the room, and I'm pretty sure the library closes at 9. So let me get my questions here, because I tried to curate a list, keep it brief, but still explain how wonderful the work is that you've done. So Mike, Would you please explain the pieces, the actual equipment that was put into our climate resilience upgrades?
Thought these were going to be multiple choice. Okay, so the goal of the project was to implement climate resilient technology at some of our key stations. And our pilot project, our first site was really gave us a lot of information on how to progress forward with this project, because one, where our existing stations are, we don't necessarily have the option to pick the location or the orientation of the equipment that we were using. And we were given a structure, and whatever that structure was, that was our footprint, that's what we got to use. So we had decided on using solar panels with lithium iron phosphate batteries as a battery storage, power supply. And the solar panels would convert sunlight into energy that we could store. And we would use a 12 volt to 120 volt inverter to power our devices. Now, all of the equipment that's at a radiation site, the anemometer, the radiation probe, the network, and the microcomputer that runs all of it, takes about 25 watts continuously to run. Now, you'll be surprised how much energy you need to provide and store to sustain 25 watts indefinitely. We were looking at our first concept was using 85 watt panels, where we thought that we would be easily converting enough sunlight into storage energy that would power our devices. But we soon found out, especially in this part of the country, that and as you get into winter, as we all know, there's very little sun. And we did some investigation, and we went with a 170 watt panel, which is what we figured, doing the math, would, 25 watts, 170, even if we got 50% out of that in the wintertime, we'd still end up with about 85 watts to cover the loss of power drain from the devices, at nighttime. And again, that was definitely not enough. Our first location, we were limited to a roof line that had an east-west setting, and ideally with solar in this part of the country, you want to have a south-facing configuration, but we weren't allowed that. Again, we're using existing stations that were already in place, and we had to go with what we had there. So, our first site was a challenging site to begin with, because we had to get a lift to every time we needed to go make a change, and we ended up having to go with 3 panels. And if we found that anything other than a south-facing configuration would require 3 panels in our setup, and 3 panels would give us about 510 watts altogether. But again, because of where we are, based on the equator and what available sunlight that we get during the course of the year, especially in the wintertime, we're lucky if we get half of that. And that's just part of the rating of the equipment in the industry. If it says that you get 170 watts on a panel, that's based at the equator at noontime, when it's a very sunny day. So any deviation from that equator line, we have a drop off on what the efficiency of the panels are, and what the output can be.
And can I ask you, Mike, how many days of backup power were we trying to achieve?
Okay. So originally we wanted to go with 6 days of backup power. And unfortunately, there was no battery configuration that would work in our system that would give us 6 days. It was either 4 or 8. So we went with the 8. And that requires 2 batteries, two 200 amp hour batteries that are connected in parallel. So we're still running a 12 volt system. And our solar panels run anywhere between 18 and 24 volts. Now we determined that each day the 25 watts is drawing about 600 amp hours of that battery life, which is 1/4 of a battery almost every day. So we need to be ready to charge. That's why we do have 2 batteries, we give us 8 days. We can actually stretch that out to 10 too sometimes. We have, having to follow weather patterns over the past year to see which days are going to be sunlight and which weren't. We can almost predict what the outcome was going to be and how we were going to achieve the goal. And again, we've come up with a solution that even on our worst day, even on December 21st, we can still generate enough wattage to replenish the loss from previous days' usage and top off the batteries to where they need to be.
Speaking of weather, Mike, in December, we had a pretty big nor'easter. And I think I had a picture on the last slide. That there was some significant flooding in the seacoast, New Hampshire, that we're seeing a lot. And we had power outages for days for tens of thousands of people. Some of this flooding happened right where we have one of our sites in seacoast, New Hampshire. And luckily, I believe you had already done these upgrades on that site. So can you describe how that site maintained its power function while its neighbors were?
Well, again, these are completely off the grid designs, so there is no dependence on the host site's resources whatsoever. We're not connected to power, we're not connected to the internet or anything like that. So we're totally self-sustaining, and when everything else goes down in the neighborhood, our devices stay up and running. We are using AT&T hotspots, which they have a direct line of communications to the internet, and they're very durable. Everything is completely self-sustaining, and it runs when everything else goes on.
And can you explain how off-grid is different from net zero? Because I think a lot of people, when they think of solar, they think of the panels that they see on people's roofs. How is what you did and our off-grid design different from a net zero setup?
Yeah, so the major difference is we're not connected to the grid in any whatsoever, anywhere whatsoever. We're not connected to the house or the business or whatever the location is. We're not connected to their electrical system in any way whatsoever. We're entirely independent, so that we're on our own. We can actually put these out in a field somewhere if we had to. That's the way the logistics of the equipment works. They're completely standalone devices.
And in terms of our carbon footprint, I think we did a calculation that across these 6 sites, we were saving about the amount of carbon as a car would emit in a year. Does that sound?
Yes, that's about right. We figured it out.
I just wanted to get that point out because I think it's really impressive. So, and I had a slide up here, but we had some really incredible partners, and some of them are in this room, that helped us execute this project. But hundreds of hours were spent by Mike putting together the project design, drawing electric diagrams, procuring the equipment. And speaking of which, the last question I wanted to ask you is, how many years can you rely or can we expect these new upgraded systems to operate?
The equipment's all guaranteed to run for at least 10 years. The batteries are good for 10 years. Everything's good for at least 10 years, which will bring us into our next generation of equipment. And I got to give kudos to my installation team partner, Chris North, because I couldn't have done this without him. We had some very precarious situations. Team effort all the way.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate you coming up here and telling us about this project.
It was a pleasure.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask, are these cell connected? I know they're
I mean,
cell connected, cell.
yes, they're monocrystalline connected.
Through
Yeah.
a cell.
Yes.
And we will have some Q&A at the end as well. If you think of more questions for Mike, he will be sitting up here available in a panel. So next, I would like to invite up our guest speaker, Dr. Thomas Webler, who has traveled through the rain for hours to get to us. So thank you so much.
Hopefully they work, yay. Super, thanks. Hi, I'm
get some water down to
Oh, great, thanks. I'm Tom Webler, and I used to teach at Keene State Environmental Studies and Antioch, New England Graduate School in New Hampshire for 25 years. And I also have a research institute in Massachusetts called the Social Environmental Research Institute. It's a nonprofit. We're interested in all things got to do with technology and risk. So we've worked a bunch on issues of nuclear energy, nuclear cleanups at weapons sites. We've done climate adaptation planning all up and down the East Coast with communities, worked on industrial safety issues. So I'm interested in anything to do with risk and danger. Thank you. Oh, are we good? Okay. So, she asked me to speak, Sarah asked me to speak about consent-based siting. Wasn't really clear about the audience. So I'm just going to quickly go over some basics here. There's the spent fuel pool, where after the used fuel comes out of the reactor, it goes in here to keep it cool, right? Those squares at the bottom are the fuel assemblies, which are long tubes, and each tubes are little pellets of uranium. And that's what gets used in the nuclear reactors. And after they're been used for a little while, they're very hot, they're putting off a lot of heat, so they have to be put into these pools. They're kept there for about 5 years until they're cool enough to be put into casks, dry cask storage. So if anybody has more questions about this, you can ask at the end. But so at nuclear power plants all around the world, and especially in the United States, we have dry cask storage because we don't reprocess fuel in the United States, not since President Carter's days. And so we have spent fuel sitting around the country in different places, about 90,000 tons of it, growing at about 2,000 tons a year, 70 sites, no place to go. Some of it's at Seabrooks, some of it's still at Rowe, Massachusetts, near where I live, which is the whole reactor's gone. All that's there are the casks and chain link fence and some guards. And Wiscasset, Maine, Vernon, Vermont, and Pilgrim or Plymouth, Mass. You're going to see the same thing when they're done decommissioning. So all this waste with no place to go. And this has been a challenge that's been known for some time. I want to read a little statement from a publication that I think is kind of interesting to give a little background. It starts like this. The president realized the nation needed a new path forward for the management of nuclear waste and spent nuclear fuel. America lacked a clear policy to develop a deep geologic repository for permanent storage. New legislation would be needed. Views of multiple stakeholders and publics had to be taken into consideration in the development of this policy. Therefore, the president established a high-level body to ventilate the issues and make recommendations. He told the committee to hold public meetings, secure public comments on draft reports, and promote transparent deliberation about the issues. And the group ended up recommending what's called the consent-based siting process. Does anybody know what I'm referring to here? This story refers to? Sarah?
I think a lot of people in the room are familiar with the term. We know. Yeah.
Did you get that mountain? Or,
Sorry?
yeah, did you get the mountain that this is referring to?
Which president? Which era? Which time? Sorry, I didn't hear it exactly. What did you say?
You said Eisenhower.
Eisenhower. Oh, unfortunately, not that bad. I thought most people would say Obama's Blue Ribbon Commission in 2012, but this is actually President Carter's days. So, I mean, we've known since the 50s that deep geological repositories are the way to handle high-level radioactive waste and spent nuclear fuel. This is a consensus the world over. Lots of countries have gone through examining all the options of shooting it into the sun, putting it on the moon, putting it in the oceans, or doing something else with it, reprocessing it. Even if you reprocess it, you still have waste from reprocessing activities. So we have to build deep geological repositories. The Finns are building one. They're getting ready to open it. They're the furthest along. The Swedes are licensing one. The French are working on developing one. And a lot of other countries are trying to find a place to put this stuff. So the question is, who's going to take it? We had Yucca Mountain, right? Yucca Mountain turned out to not be sufficient because of extra cracks, water infiltration, and seismic uncertainty. So it was shut down by Obama's administration, pretty much. And Trump did not renew it, even though he said he would. And in the end, he didn't. And I've been going to meetings on this for a long time. And in the 2000s, early 2000s, the Europeans would say to me, why are the Americans still spending money on Yucca Mountain? $30 billion we spent, because we know it's insufficient place to put waste. So the politics finally caught up with the engineering, and it's abandoned. So we need new sites. Okay, so that committee back under President Carter recommended consultation and concurrence of host communities. And when the Congress got a hold of this, wrote the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, they changed concurrence to cooperation. So concurrence implies some sort of consent, right? Can't do it unless we want you to do it. Cooperation, less strong. And as you know, what happened with the Nuclear Waste Policy Act is that Congress pushed Yucca Mountain into Nevada, even though Nevada said, no, we don't want it. So this is the timeline of what's been going on with consent-based siting. As I said, that started under Carter. And then under Obama, we had the Blue Ribbon Commission that recommended consent-based siting. This is what the Canadians have been doing. They developed a consent-based siting process. They had at least 22 towns volunteer, community volunteer. They're down to 2, and they're voting this summer on their final consent. There's been a whole sequence of things the Department of Energy have done. This is where we are now. They've published a revised process, and they just gave out $26 million to different organizations to help work toward developing a consent-based siting process, but not for a permanent repository, for an interim storage facility. Okay, that's what the Congress told the Department of Energy to do. It did not. So legally, Yucca Mountain is the only permanent geological repository for spent nuclear fuel. But the Congress has told the DOE to work on an interim storage facility. Now, the expectation is that sometime in the future, we will begin to work to find more permanent disposal facilities. And Yucca Mountain was never intended to be the only one, right? It was, in fact, the law said it can only hold 70,000 tons because we knew we wanted to have at least 2, probably 3, in order to have some geographic equity among the country. So consent and idea gaining traction, and I'm going to skip a couple slides here because I'm short on time, shorter than I think I often speak. So this is the process the Department of Energy is putting forward now. Stage 1 is some sort of process of capacity building. And this means bringing communities up to a point where they can have informed democratic deliberation about what they want for their community. So together, a community has to make a decision whether to accept an interim storage facility or not. And in order to have that discussion, communities need to have a certain capacity to have democratic dialogue without just shouting at each other or fighting, as we've seen a lot in school meetings across this country this last couple of years. So this is where we're kind of at now. Step 1 is building this capacity, and that's what that $26 million that the Department of Energy just recently awarded. After there's been some dialogue, communities, presumably what will happen is communities will volunteer to have conversations about nuclear waste. They'll say, gee, we might be interested. For example, Arkansas, the state government of Arkansas just passed the law that instructs the government of the environmental department of Arkansas to reach out to communities, to find communities that might be interested in accepting interim storage facilities for nuclear waste. So Arkansas is moving forward. New Hampshire, you might know, just repealed its law that forbid the state from taking nuclear waste. And then when it tried to reinstall the ban, that vote also failed. So New Hampshire is possibly open for business for accepting nuclear waste. And there are other states that are interested, and Indian tribes that are interested in this as well. So some outreach to these communities will happen, and then they'll talk about this. Site number 2 is there'll be technical confirmation that the site's got the right kind of bedrock or whatever to dig down and dig a half-mile down and make a big hole that will last for 500,000 years and secure the waste. And then finally, stage 3 is some sort of negotiation with the community. I think we all realize that no community is going to do this out of the goodness of their heart. They're going to want money. The states are probably going to want money too. And right now, the federal government's spending, I forget how much, but billions to store waste in all the 70 sites around the country. So some of that money will be spent to store it at this interim storage facility or facilities. So I'm really interested in this idea of consent. I've studied it. I've gone back in time. I've looked at medical consent, consent in sexual relations, consent in terms of how indigenous peoples in remote areas consent to mines and hydropower development, consent as it's represented in the United Nations agreements on human rights, consent in research ethics, and consent in the whole idea of democracy. We were talking before about how town councils use consent to make decisions. So I'm interested in this idea, and I've advised the Department of Energy on some of these things. And there's a lot of questions. Here's a few questions that we think about what this actually means. And the Department of Energy has pretty much agreed that, this is a picture from Canada. They went to a lot of remote communities and held meetings like this, that the process demands these dialogue skills, that communities need to be able to listen to each other without shouting and getting mad. They need to be able to express themselves clearly. They need knowledge and understanding and respect and equality. So the question is, how does the DOE pull this off? Does Congress make a whole new, in Canada, the government made a whole new organization outside the government to do this called the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. In Sweden, it was done by a collection of nuclear utilities. And so far in the United States, it seems like the Department of Energy is moving ahead with this job. So people also need the right attitude, and that goes also for the Department of Energy, right? It's not just for the public and the stakeholders. The government needs to have the right attitude as well. A lot of technical support will go to communities. They'll get grants. This current round of funding includes hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars for community grants to give communities the money to hire experts so that they can participate as equals with the Department of Energy. And finally, a long-term commitment that these discussions, we expect, we don't know how long an interim storage facility is interim for. Is it 20 years, 50 years, 100 years? A lot of years have been thrown out there, but surely, even if we were to start on a permanent disposal facility today, it's going to take at least 50 years till it would open, right? It's not going to happen overnight. Even the Canadians, I think they don't plan to open theirs until 2050 sometime. And hopefully their communities they're going to have a site this summer. So there's some long-term commitment. We have a lot of different stakeholders and publics that are involved in these decisions. So we need to respect that diversity. I'm really interested in this question of source communities. It's one of the things I wanted to bring up here, since Seabrook is a source community. It's benefited from the jobs and the taxes from nuclear power generation. It's also borne the risks associated with nuclear power plants operating. But do source communities have some opportunity or about obligation to work with would-be host communities? I know that Can from Roe, the Citizens Awareness Network, went down to West Texas to talk to a community there that was thinking about accepting radioactive waste. So there's a lot of challenges about how to do this. We know Congress has funded the DOE to search for an interim storage facility, not a permanent disposal facility. So if a community is considering taking an interim storage facility, they are uncertain about how long the waste will be there. The government can promise it will take it away in a certain day. Like they promised the nuclear power plants, they take all the fuel away by 1998. So it's 25 years later, and there's no hope that they're going to be taking it away soon. So promises aren't always kept. So without certainty, how can you have certain understanding? Without complete understanding, how can you have consent? So, these are some of the issues I reckon with. So I'm just wrapping up here. So is the real goal, what's the real goal of searching for interim storage? Why did the Congress push for interim storage instead of a permanent facility? Because when we've commented before, we've always said, and other people have said, you need to have a permanent facility before you build an interim storage facility. But Congress went the other way. Why? Well, there's a lot of incentive right now to rebuild America's nuclear industry with small modular reactors. And if the waste has a place to go, then that removes that argument from the developers of small modular reactors, right? Because right now people say, well, more reactors with no place for the waste to go. What are we going to do? Every small modular reactor is going to have a small containment of nuclear waste. That doesn't seem very feasible. So we don't know what the real motives are here. So it's difficult to trust DOE without knowing truly what and it's not really DOE's motives. I know some of the people in there, they're good people. It's Congress restricting what they can do. And if promises aren't kept in the community in the future, and this interim storage facility becomes a permanent facility, what does that mean for the community's consent? There's a lot of open questions here. I think a lot of communities that have closed reactors would like to see the waste gone. And understandably, they want to redevelop those sites. And you can make good arguments that it's safer to have the waste in one place than in 70 different places. But getting there seems like there's still many obstacles along the way. So thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions later. Do you want to take questions later?
I was going to open the Q&A later, unless people want to do it while they are fresh. Okay, yeah, well, why don't we do 5 minutes of Q&A for you while it's fresh?
Fresh.
Okay. Fresh. Yeah.
Okay. So I got a couple of questions. One is.
Sorry, do you mind sitting behind so people can see you?
Sorry.
Better.
Sorry.
One is that my understanding about the Nuclear Waste Policy Act is that it is actually federal law currently that there must be permanent repositories before construction of interim storage facilities. But do you?
I don't know that that's
I
true.
believe that that's actually the case.
Okay.
And if Congress is asking for these facilities, they're doing it in contravention of federal law. So it's important that all of us that are having to deal with thinking into the future about what to do with this waste, be aware that this move toward interim storage currently is illegal. And there's a good reason why. I think you expressed it before. We shouldn't be making more of this waste until we know how to permanently deal with it, not just stick it in a parking lot and drive that storage. So that was one question. The other question is, going right back to your display of these two important words. One was consultation and concurrence,
Right.
and the other was consultation and cooperation.
Right.
Well, the basis by which C-10 was founded as Citizens Within the 10-Mile Radius in the 1980s was to try to affect the evacuation planning process, decision-making process for Seabrook. And as a result of our work in the 1980s, all 6 towns in the state of Massachusetts said the plans will not work. And we forced Governor Dukakis not to sign the plans. As a result of that democratic process, the federal government changed NRC regulations to allow the utility involved to present a plan in lieu of the state.
Mhm.
So
There you go.
to
Yeah.
me, this whole question of concurrence versus cooperation is hugely important. How do we have any assurance that all of the work that it seems like you're indicating communities are going to be asked to do
Mhm.
is going to result in any kind of good faith agreement on the part of the federal government? They can just make the decision that they're going to overrule. If they find that the granite in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, is good enough for what they consider to be a good enough repository, are they going to actually listen to the people of Hillsborough who may say, we don't want it, thank you very much? So, where does
Yeah,
the buck stop?
I'm a little bit concerned because, here's what Secretary Granholm said, hearing from and working with communities interested in hosting a facility is the best way to solve the problem. It doesn't say anything about consent. Here's what Katie Hupp said, the administrator of nuclear energy. Communities have the right to explore benefits. It doesn't say anything about consent. So what's DOE's real intent here? I think it's an open question.
It doesn't have, well, I mean.
They have to demonstrate that they really mean that. If communities say no, then it means no.
And how, do you have any wisdom to offer us tonight about how we ensure, meaning, the citizens of the United States, ensure that decisions concerning the siting of high-level waste facilities, number one, gets done before interim storage is implemented, and number two, is done in a truly democratic way where the will of the people is actually respected?
Well, like you pointed out, we need a new Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Nothing can really go forward without a new legislation. And, Markey, you guys are connected to Markey. He's a huge advocate for this. So working with the Congress, to get a new law that really solidifies commitment to consent would be very important. I think that's the best way to secure our rights.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we'll save other questions for the end, if that's all right, so we can stay on track for some of our other speakers. Okay, I'm realizing now that I did not follow the agenda as printed, so sorry if that was confusing for anyone. Next up, who was supposed to be before Dr. Webler, is our own C-10's board member, Chris Nord, who's going to give us an update on the decommissioning of Plymouth's Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station, and also very related to what we just heard, updates in the fight from New Mexico and Texas in their consent battle, or lack of consent battle, with a consolidated interim storage facility in their own states. So Chris, would you please join us? And do one administrative function for our Zoom folks. There we go. Thanks, Chris.
Yep. So if I just speak forward, the mic is going to pick it up. I don't need to worry about a mic. I don't see it, so.
It's right by the computer.
All right.
Just to make sure people can see you.
Is it possible to move this just a little bit so I can put my notes down? Does that work? Just don't drop the computer. Okay, try.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry to have hogged the question and answer part, and I know other people wanted to speak, so we'll get a chance to do that. And I think I can say hello to Diane Turco, who's joining us digitally over the internet tonight. Diane was our guest speaker a year ago. She's someone that I've gotten to know pretty well over the last 12 months. She is the director of Cape Town Winders down on the South Shore. And they've had their hands full in the last couple of years with the decommissioning of the Pilgrim plant and some of the desires of the current owners of Pilgrim to greatly pollute the biosphere in the area where we all live. But I wanted to start tonight by just telling you a little story about one of Diane's friends that works with Diane all the time, whose name is Elaine. She's a retired French teacher. I got to know her a little bit the last couple of times that I was down there. And I realized that she was trying to figure out why on earth this guy from the North Shore kept showing up at these decommissioning hearings to try to say something to these people on this committee that didn't necessarily want to hear from someone from out of town. You know, they want the fishermen, they want the local citizens, but what's this guy doing here from Newburyport? And it got me thinking that it was 40 years ago, right now, in 1983, that I was in Plymouth interviewing teachers from the Indian Brook School, which is an elementary school very close to the Pilgrim, then operating Pilgrim nuclear power plant, where the faculty at the school had experienced this huge spate, statistically significant spate of birth abnormalities, cancer among the faculty members. There were all kinds of health problems. And there was a study that was done, undertaken, and they were trying to figure it out. Anyway, there was this comical moment that this was all part of a slideshow that I did a long time ago called Circles Around the Fire, where I was looking at the problems around the Pilgrim plant, the Vermont Yankee plant, the Maine Yankee plant, and then the construction at Seabrook. Anyway, when we were down there in Plymouth and I'm interviewing these teachers, they started telling me this story about how the federal government was testing this cow. They found a cow within the 10-mile radius at some farm and they tested it. And the radiation level was high. Well, and I said, really, what did they do? And they sort of, they laughed, this gallows humor. They said, well, they tested another cow. They went outside the 10-mile radius and they found a cow to test that, didn't read high, and that's what they used. So, this just tells us something about what's gone on in Plymouth for the last 40 years with the Pilgrim nuclear power plant. 5 years after that, in the late 1980s, Boston Edison decided rather than to spend the $500 million that they were going to spend on their capital improvements, they could have spent that money on purchasing energy efficient lighting fixtures for the entire greater Boston area and saved more energy than the plant produces. But what did they do? They upgraded their atomic reactor so that they created, 25 years more nuclear waste when they could have been saving energy if they had invested wisely. And now, after wringing all of the profit that they have been able to out of this jalopy of a reactor that should have never been built, because General Electric's own engineers made it clear when that design first came forward that it was a crappy design and it should never be brought into production. Now we have a current old owner, Holtec, who got into the industry building these storage facilities for dry cask storage facilities, some of which we have right here at Seabrook. And now what they've done is they've transformed themselves into a decommissioning corporation. They will buy these reactors that are ready to decommission, and then they're going to take whatever profits they can from the decommissioning, and they're going to shortcut as much of the decommissioning process as they can, so they can wring the profit out of that and get it all shipped away. And that's what they've been doing at Indian Point on the Hudson River, and that's what they've been doing at Pilgrim. And what they have left, they're at a hiatus right now. Some of you may know this, that Holtec has declared that they're not going to do any more decommissioning on the plant, no more decommissioning work, taking the pieces apart, for 4 years until the market turns around, because the market got soft enough. They were worried about not having enough money to finish their job. But in the midst of all of this, they are holding 1 million gallons, more than 1 million gallons. I think it's 1.1 something million gallons of radioactive water that they claim comes entirely from the decommissioning process. I don't know that that's true. I doubt that it's true. I think that some of the radioactive water they have is water that was extant when the plant shut down, but it is known to be highly radioactive. And if you go on the Cape Downwinders website, there are a lot of articles about testing that has recently been done by very reputable scientists from reputable universities who are showing that this is highly dangerous radioactive material that Holtec wants to dump into Cape Cod Bay. And the way that they're claiming it's okay to do this is they want to dilute their radioactive water with millions of gallons of ocean water until the radiation levels are below EPA standards, and then they can flush it into Cape Cod Bay. And it's really important to point out right here that 17 years ago, the National Academies of Science issued their 7th report on the biological effects of ionizing radiation. They've done 7 of these since the dawn of the commercial atomic age in the United States. So BEIR 7, BEIR 7, in 2006, finally concluded what many scientists not affiliated with the industry, not promoting anything, just looking at it from a public health point of view, have known all along, and that is that there is no safe level below which, there's no level below which radiation is not harmful. Radiation is harmful all the way down to the smallest levels. And there's a Canadian researcher named Petkow, Abram Petkow, who published a book in the 1970s called The Petkow Effect that showed that low levels of radiation are actually more efficient at damaging cells than high levels because they don't interfere with each other in their bombardments. They all go straight to the cellular structures. So a given quantity of radiation from low level can be more harmful. The reason I'm pointing all of this out is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is providing cover for the nuclear industry in this country, all over the country, to allow Holtec and like corporations who are going in to wrest the profits from these retired facilities, giving them license to dump highly dangerous radioactive water into the waterways of the United States. And they are doing that knowing that the National Academies of Science 17 years ago showed conclusively that there's no level below which this stuff is not dangerous. We are creating a nightmare for future generations if we allow this to go down. So what I'm saying to you is what I believe Diane Turco would say to you tonight, what Elaine, my friend down there, would say to you tonight, that we have to stop this now. And because we're an affected community, a concerned community, because we live close to Seabrook, we have to realize that if we don't act in concert with our friends down at Pilgrim. And I have to say right here, I wish you all could meet all of them because they're just like us, they're just people who have way too much else to do to be concerned with this. Diane Turco was a grandmother. She loves her grandkids. She thought by the time Pilgrim closed, oh, my work is done. And it, I'm looking at Debbie Grinnell, right, your work isn't done either. We're all still at it. And that's because we recognize that we have to stop the lies and the deception that are causing these insults to our biosphere that could have an impact and will have an impact if going unchecked for many, many, many generations into the future. So that's why I'm going to Plymouth as much as I can. I've made a complete pain in the neck of myself to the decommissioning board. They tried to talk me back down into my chair the last time I got up to testify, like, you again? I would love to see some of you come down with me to one of these decommissioning advisory panel hearings and tell them, like, we live just up the street from you. If you allow this to happen, they're going to be doing it to us too. What about the lobsters? What about the shellfish? What about the fish? What about the mothers that eat the fish that has the strontium 90 in it? And where is that going in relationship to the little child who you're nursing? It's that kind of thing that we have to pay attention to while we're here. So that's my report about Pilgrim.
Did you also want to see us?
Oh, right. Sorry, I didn't realize that I was going to be talking about West Texas, but I can just tell you that West Texas and New Mexico there's been some confusion about West Texas and Mexico with regard to interim storage. Here's the skinny that I understand on this so-called interim storage, which is sort of a scary, fraught phrasing. Who on earth says it's interim? And does anyone here actually believe that interim means anything less than 100 years? Why not 1,000 if it's going to be 100? We're going to let this stuff sit on a parking lot in West Texas for the next 1,000 years? Why are they being allowed? Why are we allowing them to build interim storage facilities in homes of poor people, poor Mexican Americans, poor Blacks, poor Native American communities who don't have political power, so that they will take on our waste and it's going to sit in a park? This is absurd. And this is where the environmental justice aspect of this comes into play. We all should be alarmed and incensed that we're going to let this go down. So the misunderstanding about West Texas that I know is that there have been votes recently. The West Texas and Mexico each originally seemed to be consenting to the notion of having interim storage. But in the last year, there have been votes within those two states, and they have said no to interim storage. So unless there's some way that the federal government is choosing to overrule that, it may be that that will stand. But I can tell you that I know that one way that the federal government and the in collusion, if you will, with the nuclear industry is trying to get around this provision of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act that I was talking about before in that question and answer period with our guest, that they should not be, cannot legally be building a interim storage facility until we have permanent repository. They're saying, well, if someone owns it privately, that's not a federal facility, it's a private facility. So a company like Holtec can go build an interim storage facility and the federal government say, that's no matter to us. I mean, that is bogus, you know, and we should not be allowing it. When the nuclear waste leaves the facility where it was generated with a commercial reactor, my understanding, and someone can tell me if they think I'm wrong, my best understanding of this is it becomes the property of the Department of Energy at that moment. And it should not be considered in somebody's private domain. Just because it's going to West Texas, it's going to sit in a Holtec facility or whoever it is. We should just not be allowing this to go down. So there are a lot of reasons why we should be speaking to our legislators and be making these points and talking back to these advisory panels that are greasing the skids for the dumping of radioactive waste into Cape Cod Bay. I mean, we need to really be speaking up more than ever right now, because momentous things are happening. And if we want to stop them, we have to do it immediately. How's that? I got a little bit of it out anyway. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And one thing that I don't think had come up with either yours or Dr. Webler's was how many headlines we've been reading about train disasters and thinking about how this nuclear waste would be transported, however it would be transported. And I think that's a question that a lot of people are wondering as well, that they might unwittingly become a community that's impacted by nuclear waste when they're neither the source nor the ultimate destination, but they're somewhere in between. So we've heard a lot about what experts like Dr. Webler are doing to help with consent-based siting, what other groups like Citizens Awareness Network and Cape Downwinders are doing. And now we're going to circle back to what C-10 is doing. And I have a wonderful representative, our president, Patricia Skibby, who's going to come up and give us an update on what's cooking at Seabrook Station and what the C-10 research team has been focusing on in the last year.
Good to see. Didn't say anything yet. I just want to mention, given the last two speakers, is our conclusion not that we shouldn't be making messes that we cannot clean up? Yeah, because that seems to be the theme there. Completely irresponsible. So this talk is a little bit later than what you've just been hearing, because as Sarah said, it's about the internal workings of specifically the research team at C-10. I am a terrible extemporaneous speaker, so I'm reading pretty much. So this is a report on the accomplishments and burdens of our amazingly fabulous research team at C-10, or RT. I want to acknowledge each member. Most of you are here. Debbie Grinnell, Tom Zabo, who's not here. Tom, I'm so sorry. See you. Sorry. Deb Breen, our newest member to both the board and the RT. Chris Nord, whom you know. Sarah Donmes, who's definitely not here. Angel Kiefer, and me, Pat Skibby, acting chair. We have a very strong team, scientists, techies, longtime Seabrook ASR, alkali silica reaction experienced people. We're actually a bunch of what I think we could best be called is just nuclear nerds. Further, we have resource people on our advisory board with whom we consult. We're outstandingly fortunate to have a very deep bench, and we use them unashamedly. While we do have a very strong group, some of the people are newbies. Therefore, one thing we've done very recently was to have a live meeting completely dedicated to orientation. Each member got a frighteningly thick packet of various basic NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, research materials, along with some commentary from non-NRC power experts. And I brought the package so you can get an idea what I mean by thick. The good news is everybody read everything. There was no shirking of homework. It was great. What does the research team actually do? We review and respond to the many, many inspection reports that are generated from the NRC. Sorry, this thing is so thick that my papers are sliding around. So this is a list from the NRC of the inspections over the next year and a half. There are really a lot of reports that are going to be generated, so watch out, RT. there's more to come. Sorry, do I have these things? Sorry. We have no direct contact with NextEra at all, Seabrook's owner. Rather, we have to rely on the NRC and its stated mission, which is, quote, to provide reasonable assurance of adequate protection of public health and safety, to promote the common defense and security, and protect the environment around nuclear power plants. We take this mission with a grain of salt. If we were totally confident that the NRC was living up to the demands of the mission statement, we wouldn't need a research team. We wouldn't even need C-10, but we are not totally confident. The NRC issues IIRs, Integrated Inspection Reports, quarterly. These come to some of us automatically because we are enrolled in a public access system called ADAMS, Agency-Wide Document and Management Systems. Such reports are available to all the public via the Federal Register /ADAMS, which is published online daily, a list of thousands of federal documents every single day. We review these IIR reports and respond in writing with comments and questions. Our amazing executive director has arranged for several RT members and Sarah herself to have a Zoom with the 2 resident inspectors at Seabrook quarterly to discuss our responses. We can also ask for written responses, but getting those takes much longer because the resident inspectors must have their responses to our response reviewed up the chain of command before they can send out any written responses. Over the course of a number of years of studying these IRRs, we have identified disturbing patterns. The 2 major ones, how did I do this? This is so embarrassing. Sorry. Well, this is just terrible. Sorry, give me a minute, please. No direct contact. Okay, I did that. Well, do I not have that page? Well, it's okay. I know what they are. The 2 major patterns that we see is that it seems that no matter how serious the violation of the NRC regulations that are called out in the IR reports, the reports never classify them as any more than green. And green means a non-cited violation, which means there's no enforcement, no fine. And while the violation does have to go on the plant's corrective action list, we're always unclear on the level of follow-up because the information is not public. Second, our understanding is that many items languish on the corrective action list. And in fact, we have learned from the latest IIR that several fixes that were to be completed by 2022 are now not scheduled to be fixed by the plant owner until 2026. This does not really give us confidence. What else does the RT do? The RT also deals with irregular issues, such as the license amendment request that has now been submitted by NextEra and is now being heard by the NRC. That LAR is 562 pages long. NextEra is asking the NRC permission to consolidate the emergency response teams from each of its NextEra's owned nuclear power plant sites. So they own plants in 2 different locations in Florida. They own Seabrook, of course, in New Hampshire, and they own sites in Wisconsin. They want to consolidate the emergency response teams that are now at those sites. They want to consolidate them into 1 site in Florida. For fairly obvious reasons, we don't think this is a very good idea. The RT's job is to read the 562 pages of the Common Fleet Emergency Plan and prepare comments that will be used by the NRC to help make their decision on the LAR. Right now, 2 of our members are using specialized software to section the 562 pages and discover the boilerplate parts so that we can focus our work on the parts that are unique to each plant site. We need to have our formal commentary prepared by September. One last, and if it weren't so annoying, it would be funny item, is that the NRC uses a zillion acronyms. I have used some in this talk, but I have decided to take it easy on you. Deb Breen, I need you on this. When you found that list, it says Deb Green discovered a, how many pages long was that list of acronyms? 100 pages? Oh my gosh, I put 47, I think, I thought it was exaggerating. So there's so many acronyms in NRC speak, over 100 pages, like a list of the acronyms, right? Unbelievable. Sadly, Deb also discovered that the basic ones we keep coming across are not even on that list, right? So I used NRC, Adams, LAR, IRR, and ASR, which you probably all know those. This means that reading the NRC documents is completely frustrating, almost another language. Plus, they keep coming up with new ones, evidenced by Deb, who's one of the newbies, trying to use the NRC's own published list to understand the NRC's talk, and the acronyms they're using aren't even in there. The research team is here for the long run. If this work and the nuclear nerd status appeals to any of you, please see me after the meeting.
Thank you, Pat. I think you'll have a lot of takers. It was very compelling. If anything, just for the chuckles. It's difficult to take a really serious topic and try to find the levity where you can. And that's something that we're challenged with, not just in our own C-10 circle, because it can be fatiguing. Although I don't think I can say that, because a lot of the folks in this room have been at it for 40 years. But for the general public, when we're trying to reach them with our mission and trying to encourage them to want to be informed about this, it can be a scary topic. And they don't really want to hear about how there might be problems at their local nuclear power plant. So trying to find ways to keep it simple, not using a grocery list of acronyms, and finding levity where you can are tools that we're trying to use to reach broader audiences. So I'll conclude the meeting just by wrapping up. You know, we've talked a lot about what the problems are, and I want to give you a little bit of the insights into what C-10 is trying to do about it, looking ahead. So we will never stop. Like Pat said, we're not going anywhere. And we've got your back. We are a citizen-led group. We have no vulnerability to bias from corporations, from government interests, from political entities. And so we stay true to our mission in that we stand for the people who live here. We will be attending at the NRC's annual public meeting. So it's kind of like this one, but I like to make a joke that they won't have as good a food because they will have no food. And there probably won't be very many chuckles. But we will be there, and we hope that other members of the public attend as well. We have those quarterly Zoom meetings that we're going to be doing with the inspectors about the inspection reports and more. And we'll continue to coordinate with those really generous experts. Dr. Webler, I have your cell phone number now. And the false alarm that I talked about, that I kind of opened the meeting with. I think a lot of people were like, well, that was crazy. And then they went about their life thinking there's no way that could happen again. Well, just a few months ago, there was a siren in Newfields, New Hampshire, which is right next to my hometown of Stratham, New Hampshire, where I live, that had an inadvertent activation. Now, this didn't come from the plant. It was an issue at the town level, but it sort of exposes how there's this totally tangled and disorganized mess of who has responsibility for the siren system, who should be maintaining it, who should be activating it, what's the technology, how old is it, does it work? And I'm aware that there are some talks with the plant and with the state and the NRC on the fate of the siren system in general. There may be a move to just go to the iPause Amber Alert type system. So we are staying tuned for that because, again, we won't stand for sacrificing public safety to take the easy road or the less expensive road. So we got your back on that. And that license amendment request that Pat noted, I'm really glad to hear you found a software to help you with the 562 pages. And we'll continue to reach our communities, especially our youth. We're going to be at those, we were just at the Amesbury block party, and I think we interacted with, dozens and dozens of families with young children. And it was really great to get their attention, even if just to get them to sign up for those code red alerts, even if just to get them to be aware of potassium iodide tablets. And very exciting, we are going to be adding a new radiation monitoring site to Star Island in the Isles of Shoals, which is really fantastic. There is no radiation monitoring by any entity off the coast. So any emissions that have been coming from the plant that when there is an eastward blowing wind is being completely undetected. And there are people out there. There are people that live at Star Island year round. There are thousands of visitors a year. And there are other islands in the Isles of Shoals that have private homes that are research islands where UNH students will stay for months and months at a time. And so these people deserve radiation monitoring as well. In addition to, again, that data contributing towards accountability and ensuring that the effluent releases from the plant are exceeding what they are allowed to release. So we will be doing that in September, and we'll be doing some fundraising and some fun events to drum up interest in supporting us on that. So please stay tuned for that information. So I'm going to close the presentation part of the meeting, and I'm going to ask all of the speakers, I'm going to bring some chairs up, and maybe we can all sit up front and take questions from both the attendees and the virtual folks. So virtual folks, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat, and we will try to answer some virtual questions as well as in person. Sure, virtual folks can see that. We've got Pat at the end there.
We all pull in?
Maybe a little. That's good. Mike, do you want to come in too? I'm sure people want to ask you questions too.
It's not going to be the same without me.
So I don't see any virtual questions, so let's start over here so you can ask your question of Dr. Webler last time. Would that be okay? To start with
I
you?
think I did, but I think I forgot it.
Okay, well, please circle back.
Well, yeah, I got the question. And the other question I actually had for Mike about the data. I know you can go online and get data from these monitoring sites. Are they the same ones you're talking about? Or?
Monitoring sites.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I follow the question. We have our own network of monitoring sites that handles data and uploads it to a repository where we use it, analyze it.
Yeah.
It's
I'm
not.
talking about through the internet. You can go to a website and I can look at
No. No, you have to fill out information request form with the DPH, and then we can send you all the information, whatever you want.
Well, I know there are sites that you can go to in the
Yes.
state, so those are not.
No, they are not. There is Safecast, and there are a couple other ones you can't think of off the top of my mind. Yes, but they do not do real-time monitoring like we do. And in many instances, the data is actually not uploaded for 2 or 3 or even 6 months at a time.
Okay.
There's EPA's RadNet, which you can get through the EPA website. And that is almost real time. They call it near real time. And so it can be, it's similar to our data, but not as robust and not as in the minute. Tom.
All right, I'd like to ask our distinguished speaker, Dr. Webler. Right now, well, you talked about what happens to nuclear waste in the interim and long term, but right now, nuclear waste is being stored on site at the reactors. And what is the consent of communities about knowing that they have large pools of nuclear waste in their community?
Exactly. Department of Energy Office of Nuclear Energy Office often says that the source communities have not consented to storing waste. So that is one of their reasons for building an interim storage facility where a community has consented. So you're right, yeah. I agree with that. That's been a point, they've made that point recently quite a bit. They make it on every talk I make. So it's an important point.
I have a question. Is that okay if I ask a question?
Yes, I was actually, before you do, Chris, do you recall, we've had some meetings with some Congress people about the consolidated interim storage non-consent issue. And there were some pieces of legislation that were being put through that dealt with, I don't know if it was just compensating communities that are
Right.
de facto hosts of nuclear waste right now.
The Stranded Act.
Yes, are you aware of that at all, Dr. Webler?
No.
I think that might tie into that conversation a little bit. I think it might just be monetary.
Well, that's a piece of legislation that has been tabled for the time being. I'm not exactly sure what its disposition is. Maybe someone here knows and can enlighten us, but the Stranded Act is a reference to stranded communities, communities that are in exactly the position that Tom was talking about, where there is nuclear waste being left, the plant has been closed. I mean, the case of Pilgrim is a great
Yes.
example right now because their plant is closed and they've got nuclear waste sitting on site, some of which, as we've discussed, is, up for being pumped into the ocean. So the Stranded Act would give some kind of money to the communities to do something differently with the waste, or at least to protect the community from the waste. I'm not sure exactly.
Maybe
what
some
provision.
real-time radiation monitoring.
Hopefully it would involve that. Maybe some kind of a structure around it. I don't know, but yeah, radiation monitoring should be a part of all of this. Absolutely.
Chris, tell me if this is correct. Years ago, when we started to have casts that were dry casts and put them on outside of this nuclear plant.
Yeah.
And I called the Department of Energy and they said, we can't pick them up. And I said, well, why not? And he said, because that's a decision made by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So the decisions that we made for all the tests that are through the NRC are not at a level that DOE would pick them up. So honestly, on the phone, I couldn't believe the answer. And I said, you are telling me that as the Department of Energy, you have not spoken to the NRC to develop casts that are on the ground at all these plants, and you can't pick any of them up? And he said, no. So I said, it can't be that complicated, and it can't be as much money as you are somehow trying to impress me with, we can't afford to do it, is in fact you can, because if you could correct them so that the ones that are actually here online, you could pick up and take to an interim or a complete plant.
Yeah.
And that he said that's a problem of Congress. It's not my problem. So we go in this circle of incredible issues.
Well, I think that problem that you're illustrating is exacerbated, if my understanding is correct, by the fact that oftentimes the storage canisters are not transportation
Worthy.
qualified. That in
Because the
order-
NRC
that in
hasn't
order to actually-
requested it.
That in order to actually remove
Yeah.
the radioactive material, it has to then be taken out of the storage
Right.
canister on site and then put into a different canister for the transport.
Which
And-
means you have to have a new spent fuel pool,
What do you put it, would put it back into the old.
if
spent
it's
fuel
still
pool?
there.
Right,
If not,
if it's still there, right.
if it's not there, you have to build one
Yeah.
in order to transfer them into a permanent one. It's amazing, isn't it?
Sounds like more profit to be made by someone.
Pat, I'm sorry, before we get to Debbie, do you want to ask the question you had earlier?
Oh, I wanted to ask you, is there a definition for the word interim and the word permanent in the situation?
Not that I know of. Legally, I don't know. I'm not that good on the law, but the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, it would be great to know more about that. How, when they have a whole definition of terms in the beginning of the act, which I can see. I know repository means permanent long term, so interim must be something before that.
I'm pretty sure we are all going to be dead. The definition of the term.
So true. So true.
If I may.
Yes, the
Well, yeah, follow up on this, exactly, it's important for us. I lost my train of thought here. What was I saying? Oh, that we should, thank you, we should be considering Yucca Mountain as an interim facility. Because Yucca Mountain was never rated by the US Geological Survey to be a valid container for nuclear waste for more than 10,000 years. 10,000 years is a tiny fraction of the longevity of the most dangerous long-lived radionuclides like plutonium. Half-life of 24,000 years, which means that after 24,000 years, this quantity that had been produced is now just as this quantity, half of what was there, is now just as radioactive as the day that it had originally fissioned.
Yeah.
And that process then goes on for another 24,000 years. So 500,000 years, 500,000 years, we are likely to be dealing with the toxicity of plutonium generated today. So the whole notion of what's interim really has to be carefully reviewed and consented to by all of us, because the nuclear industry has been attempting to put a fast one over on all of us for the last 50 years. And before we retire from this scene, you know, someone just, I think it was you, Beth, said we're gonna all be dead. Well, you know, before that happens, I'm hoping that we can change the way this is going, because we're creating a hellish situation for the generations to come after.
Deb, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I was just curious, this is a question for everybody. I was just curious, is there an understanding at some level of the capacity that's actually needed between just the waste we have now, plus the waste that's being generated now, for a permanent storage facility? Like, hypothetically, do we know what capacity is needed, or is that something that still isn't understood? Because basically what we're saying, if all of these places are interim, that means they're temporary, and then the waste will go to the quote-unquote permanent facility. Well, how big does that have to be while we're still generating waste?
And that's a good question. And on top of that is, what's the type of waste? If we start developing small modular reactors, there's about 70 different technologies out there right now, and they produce different types of wastes. It can't all just be thrown together with the waste from our oil and water reactors, or, you know, the ones that we're operating now. So we have to keep these different types of waste separate as well and stored. So the future is difficult to predict. It's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So if we have 1,000 small modular reactors by 2050, we're going to need a lot of space. And fusion, we should talk about fusion sometime, because that creates a tremendous amount of low-level radioactive waste. That something like 20 times the amount of low-level radioactive waste we already dispose of. They're estimating if you have a decent amount of fusion power plants, where's all that going to go? So there's been some interesting studies about how to manage the low-level radioactive waste from fusion in terms of diluting it with existing mining or scrap metal, and you know, which is probably not going to make you very happy if our metal is diluted with radioactive metals.
That's BRC,
But
a low regulatory concern.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, with regarding the small modular reactors, some of these are being designed to be waste users. There's a company in Denmark, Copenhagen Atomics, they're building what they call a waste management reactor. You would take it up to someplace like Seabrook, and it would use that waste and burn it and produce electricity. I mean, I don't know when it will be available, but it's something that, people are seriously working on, doing something like that. All of that waste most of it can be burned in a reactor. And then it's gone good forever.
Great solution, wouldn't it?
So I have another question for Chris, because Debbie brought up, how do we know the capacity that we're facing? And the thing that's amazing to me is with Yucca, before they closed it and said it wasn't adequate, they had actually created the technical necessity, and they satisfied their situation of exactly what to do. And then they discovered that they created an area that wasn't big enough to carry what we had already, not even to think about what was coming. In fact, Seabrook would not have been included into Yucca because Yucca wasn't large enough. When we were producing weight at that point, they couldn't accept ours. So they had not established the capacity. It's amazing, isn't it? And we're still facing those problems now.
Well, the way I would like to answer what we just said, to respond to what you just said, is this, that for years, I didn't want to have any part, I didn't want to play any part in what was going to happen to the waste. That was so not my problem. Like, you all made that problem, go off and fix it,
Right.
But the fact is that if we don't take these problems on, lesser solutions that come way short of fulfilling the needs that are actually there may likely be put in place.
Exactly.
And because we have this vestigial democracy within which we can work, we have some kind of opportunity left to make enough noise to try to make something good happen out of this terrible soup that we've got going. I mean, when I see a map of the United States and see how much radioactive pollution there is all around the United States, I mean, that is the land that we are turning over to our grandchildren. And that's not acceptable, especially because this is a technology that must end. I mean, the nuclear industry doesn't want to hear it, but there are so many better ways to make the energy that we need than doing this. And some of what we're dealing with is we've been sold, or our society around us has been sold this notion that we have to use huge amounts of energy. So that, we have to have all of these high-tech ways to do it, but that's obviously not the case. It's going to be possible to make the power that we need in a much cleaner fashion that would allow us to never have to use nuclear. We have to summon the collective will, not just in this room, but collective meaning our democratic collective. We have to summon the democratic collective will to bring this to a close and implement what's really needed. And we have to do it right away. Because we're going down this road that's going to, it's sort of like, to me, it's analogous to climate change. Every single year that goes by, it's going to get worse. And, I speak from direct experience, having to stand out there in the sun in the summertime and try to get my work done. I mean, it's getting more difficult. Well, it's going to get more difficult with this technology too. And if we can't solve it, are our children going to solve it? I don't see very many young people right here.
We have a question from one of our virtual folks.
Sure.
That would be okay if I ask that. And it's a tie-in, Chris, to exactly what you were just talking about. And this is from Diane Turco. And, she sort of pointed out what we said too, which is that what they're experiencing in Plymouth with Pilgrim Station is a foreshadow to what we can expect here. And things that are allowed there, will set precedent for what might be allowed here. The same way we feel like ASR is our responsibility. I think Pilgrim is hoping that we might follow suit with some of the things that have worked for them. And in that vein, Diane has asked, is there action at Seabrook to address the same types of issues that they're experiencing at Pilgrim? And I think that right now we've just been in the contemplative phase for the most part, but it seems like the roadmap that has worked the most, that I've heard from Diane and I've heard in the news and from Chris, is legislation. The Ocean Sanctuaries Act, putting it on local ballots, really the grassroots organizing to get local ordinances and state laws in place that don't allow for the dumping of the local nuclear waste, creates an opportunity at least to have some type of injunction or some type of pause to the plan being executed. So it's something that C-10 has to think about. We are a grassroots organization by nature, and we've worked really well with legislators in the past to advocate and to educate them on the issues and to point out what their constituents care about, because we have our finger on the pulse of thousands of constituents that they are authorized to serve only by the consent of those constituents who put them into office. So we definitely would, Diane, be looking to take all of the pages from your playbook, especially the stuff that worked well, and keep an eye on, we have an ocean too. So that's obviously the solution to pollution is dilution. That's obviously going to be the de facto choice when a company like Holtec comes in to do the decommissioning work. So we're going to need to be prepared.
Which brings up the question. I'm sorry. No, go ahead, Dave.
All right, I will, because it follows up directly on that. So I probably know the least about this out of everyone in the room, but a little more over a year ago, Big Brother, Google started feeding me a lot of articles on nuclear safety. Some of you can probably guess why. And so I've read a number of them, and I've seen all sorts of suggestions for getting rid of the casts, the nuclear waste, drilling huge, really deep holes in the earth and sticking down things. But for the water, for the radioactive water, that 100 million gallons, what is the other solution besides putting it in the ocean? Because I haven't seen anything about that.
Just wait. It has a half-life of 12 years, right? So.
Well, they talked about spreading it out into say and letting it evaporate.
We have to be careful about that quantity, because the fact that tritium has a half-life of 12 years means that it has a toxic life of as much as 200 years. You have to understand that, because it goes in this 12-year cycle, okay? So after 12 years, half, after 12 years, quarter, after 12 years, an eighth, but there's still a quantity of it that remains radioactively toxic until that whole cycle plays out. And that's why plutonium is dangerous for 500,000 years with a 24,000-year half-life. So we have to be careful when we think about these radionuclides. Iodine-131 has a half-life of 8 days, but it's dangerous for a couple of months. It's not just 8 days.
Well, what do you do with it?
What do you do with what?
Water.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, there are other things to do that are safer and cheaper right now. And one of them is to keep it right where it is, in dry cask storage, not in a parking lot. But some of you may know about the concept of hardened on-site storage, HOS, which is something that I did a lot of research on years ago, and C-10 helped to produce a whole presentation about hardened on-site storage. But hardened on-site storage is about separating the casks, making the casks robust enough, separating the casks so that they're not sitting together. They go in the ground, in a berm, and they're covered by steel, so that if one of those casks was attacked by a missile or by a terrorist strike of some kind, it wouldn't end up impacting all of the casks. Right now, the way they're going to situate these interim storage facilities in the Southwest or wherever they end up in the country, they're going to just put all these casks right next to each other in a storage, parking lot. That's the notion. It's not hardened. It's not robust. It's not protected from a terrorist attack. It's not underground. It's just cheap. So that's one thing, is to wait. You know, secondarily, if there is some kind of a place to send it, which I'm not saying that I want, but if there is an interim storage facility to send it to, I would rather that it go there than go into the Atlantic Ocean. Because what we are releasing a horror on the Eastern Seaboard by doing that. We don't know what the ramifications will be, but they would be realized over the course of many, many, many decades.
Right.
And there's no reason to do that. The reason to do that is that Holtec wants out of their liability as quickly as they can, which is one reason why Diane and Elaine and my other new friends down there on the South Shore, who I wish all of you could get to know, they're concerned about Holtec right now because Holtec, having stopped their work on decommissioning for at least 4 years because their prospects in the market have gone sour, they have more reason to dump this liability, not less. See what I mean? They're in dire straits. They would love to get rid of this stuff right now. And there's nothing that tells any of us, and I believe I'm speaking for Diane when I say this, that they wouldn't just go ahead knowing that there's going to be penalty. They can just release, they can pump the stuff, and we find out a week later that it's been done. What's going to happen? They're going to get fined. Well, getting fined that's the cost of doing business to them. So,
And also, just to take a world view, they have the same problem in Fukushima right now, with a lot more treated water that they're going to dump into the Pacific Ocean. And there's a lot of controversy about that, but it's significantly more than 1 million gallons. And they keep producing it every day.
right.
So they can't store it forever. Kind of stuff.
Isn't Holtec contractually bound to have this decommissioning process completed in a timely fashion? When they give them a certain amount of time, or they guarantee a certain amount of time?
I don't know the answer to that. I'm guessing by their declaration that they were going to stop for these 4 years, that they're within their contract.
Unless they're just gonna fine them.
Right. Maybe they're just doing what they want to do, who cares what the consequences are. You know.
So I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure that all contracts have to have a date by which whatever it is accomplished.
Yeah.
And otherwise, it's not a valid contract.
And if there are amendments made, we do. C-10, myself just participated in a webinar with decommissioning being the topic, and there were us speaking from It's in Our Future, and there were others who are living it now or have lived it before. And we did walk through the planning stage of the acceptance of the plan, and there is a timeline outlined in that plan, but you can make amendments to the plan. But there is a drop dead timeframe, and I believe it was 65 years.
Interesting choice of
I'm
words.
sorry. Sometimes there. And that's a regulatory structure, so again, I don't know what the consequences would be if it wasn't that. But 65 years is a long time. Probably a really long runway for a reason.
Well, there's a way in which, I'll just add this one thing and then we can go on. There's a way in which waiting is a good thing. And that's because every year that goes by, or every month that goes by, where all of these components that are radioactive are left alone, the degradation of the radioactivity takes place a little bit at a time. So they are somewhat less radioactive with every year. And that's why the notion of, what was that called, safe store, it was originally being considered for decommissioning, which was you mothball the plant, shut everything down, close it up, walk away for 30 years. Because then the shorter-lived radionuclides of all, the iodine-131 you don't have to worry about. The tritium you don't have to worry about. Because they've gone, well, tritium you still have to worry, excuse me. We've got that 200 years. You would lose a good deal of the radioactivity by doing that.
I have a question about money. That's a question for you. Well, you mentioned $36 million, which seems like that's a lot of things you're talking about, but I'm not understanding whose money that is, because commercial nuclear power plants are in theory a profit-making private entity. And yet it vaguely seems to me if DOA is getting this money to start planning about waste stuff, that that's not coming from the profit-making nuclear industry. It may be coming from taxpayers, but I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, it comes out of the consolidated appropriations bill. And as far as I understand it, it's just from the bipartisan infrastructure law, and that the nuclear waste fund is to be used to construct the permanent disposal facility. So,
I'm still not understanding whose money that is.
so I think it's taxpayer.
Taxpayer.
26
Bottom
million.
line.
Oh, 26, sorry, never mind.
26 million.
We're paying for it.
We're paying.
They're spending a lot more to,
And we pay for it, is that right?
and they're spending tremendous amount from board to support small modular reactor technology, hundreds of millions, and a fuel cycle for the small modular. So there's a tremendous amount of taxpayer money going to develop the industry.
And as we have all pointed out, no one knows where that waste is going either.
Any other questions from in-person folks or our virtual folks?
Is everybody feeling cheerful enough to?
I have a quick question. What happens if you detect a radiation spike?
Well, we have a protocol for that. Many times a single station can set off an alert, a pacemaker can do it, a truck passing by, HVAC unit kicking on can set off an alert. But if there are multiple stations setting off an alert for a reason like thunderstorms can roll through the area, they come down the Merrimack River, each station can light up and pick up radiation elevations high enough to set off an alert. So if there is elevated readings that will reach alert level for more than 3 minutes, that will kick off one alert. And if they continue every minute, it will kick off an alert. Now, Sarah and I get notified, the Department of Public Health gets notified, and then we have to respond. So, but more often than not, lately, they have been weather-related incidents. We've had a couple of incidents where Webler actually has caused a station to set off an alert. They call it naturally occurring radioactive materials, NORM. And you find it in quarries, shale quarries, and a lot of places where they get that kind of material from. So we have a protocol set in place, and it works. We respond quickly.
Any other questions? Office, okay. I know it's a ride for you, but you might want to come and see. Thank you.
All right. Well, I think that concludes the question and answer period and the entire meeting. So thank you all so much for coming. This has been a really wonderful experience. Good night to our online folks. Thank you so much for coming.